Part of growing your podcast audience is all about getting your audience members to take an action on something that you've said inside of your podcast. But how many times can you say that within your podcast? Let's talk about that coming up next. Welcome back once again. My name is Shannon, radio broadcaster, podcaster, and a podcast producer. And today's video is brought to you by my 6 clever ways to monetize a podcast. I finally have finished this book, and it is now available for you to purchase on my website at theshannman.com. I will go ahead and leave a link for the book down in the description below. Or if you want, I still have a chance for you to grab at least my top 3 ways you can monetize a podcast. You can go ahead and click on the link up here in the card that is on the screen or down in the description below. But either way, if you want to get the expanded version and a more in-depth version of how to monetize a podcast and have a little more philosophy that goes in behind monetizing a podcast, the 6 clever ways guide will definitely help you out. So today we are talking all about basically calls to action within a podcast, and how many times should you actually be mentioning a call to action inside of a podcast? This was a question that was actually asked in a Facebook group forum that I had seen earlier this last week, and I thought it was very interesting that a podcaster would really be concerned about how many times they mention a call to action inside of their podcast. Now, let's define first of all what is a call to action for a podcaster, and this is a pretty self-explanatory thing, but if you're new to the game, let's just go over it real quick. A call to action basically is something that you mention inside of your podcast that you want your listeners to take action on. So you might have heard in particular podcasts, depending on what podcast that you're listening to, you might hear someone say, why don't you go to our website and purchase a book? Just kind of like how I did in this very video. I ask you to do something in particular to drive traffic to go over and check out whatever it is that I want you to check out. In a podcast, you're going to mainly be utilizing the power of audio. Okay, there's no YouTube, there's no like me pointing up on a screen or telling you to and pointing down and saying go down into the description to check out where you can find the links. In podcasting, calls to action are very unique, and they're very much like radio, because in radio, we spout out so many calls to action per hour depending on the objective of what we are trying to get across. So, for instance, we may be talking about a particular concert that is coming up in the next couple of months, and I may have played a band that is going to be playing at that particular concert. I might share out a call to action to visit the radio station's website and, of course, to purchase tickets right through our website using maybe particular codes, or maybe it's just easier to go through our website, or maybe it's easier to go through our app. So asking my listeners to go and take an action on an event that is upcoming is very common. In fact, I will say it maybe 2 or 3 times in an hour on the radio. But we have to kind of keep in mind the difference between podcasting and radio, especially music radio, is that podcasting is more of a talk format, right? It's depending on the type of podcasting we're talking about here, but it's mostly a talk format. So the calls to action are probably going to be a little more sparse than, say, on music radio, because in music radio, I am required to mention certain promotions over the course of an hour so many times. So there might be a higher frequency of me mentioning something on the radio, but I'm not going to be talking as much. I may be talking for 15 seconds at a time. I may be talking for 45 seconds at a time. Podcasting is a little bit different. However, how many times can you mention a particular call to action in your podcast? Well, let's kind of break that down first of all. Now, before you jump in and you start creating any types of calls to action, I would recommend that you start planning out what you want your listeners to do. In other words, what do you want your listeners to take action on? Do you want them to subscribe to a podcast? Do you want them to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts? Or do you want them to hit the subscribe button in Stitcher or Spotify or Google Play? That's a specific call to action. And where do you put those particular calls to action, okay? Other calls to action might be, hey, get on my email list. And in order to stay in contact with me, because, social networks could go away tomorrow, but one thing that will never really go away is email. Why don't you get on my email list, and I will communicate with you that way. So asking your listeners to get on an email list is another way, or a call to action to get on there. Okay, so you could ask them to do that, subscribe to a podcast. But here's the thing. You have to understand how the podcasting platforms work, okay? So this means you have to understand how Apple Podcasts work, and you have to understand how the user interface and how the swiping all is related together, so that when you start to develop and create calls to action within your podcast, you understand the user interface interface on the phone itself so that you can direct the user to go say, hey, why don't you go ahead and click the link? It is in the show notes on Apple Podcasts. If you go to the podcast itself, if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, you can scroll up on this particular podcast and see that I've left a link down in those show notes for you, so you can, contribute to my Patreon, or you can subscribe, or you can get on my email list. There are many different calls to action that you can create inside of the show notes of your particular podcast. So understand the user interface of each platform and go with the one that works the best. Now, I'll tell you the one that's going to work the best is probably Apple Podcasts. A far larger majority of people are using Apple Podcasts than anything else, but it still doesn't mean that you should leave out Spotify, Stitcher, and Google Play. Now, let's talk about the placement of where you should put your calls to action. Now, this is all part of something that I think is important when it comes down to creating a podcast, and it's all about segmenting. And I actually talk about this in my 6 Clever Ways to Monetize a Podcast. I talk about segmenting in that particular book, and I talk about how you can monetize based off of that. But segmenting gives you a perfect opportunity to place specific calls to action in certain areas of your podcast. So let's say in the pre-roll, maybe you don't have a call to action that is right there. Most podcast listeners like to just get straight to the content, right? So when we go through and we hit play on our podcast, our podcatcher, we're going to hear maybe a sponsored message, or maybe we just jump right into the content, right? And then once we jump into the content, and then it's the host saying, hey, thank you so much for tuning in this week to Cameras Plus podcast. Today we're exploring the different types of cameras and interviewing our friend Mark, who is going to tell us all about DSLR cameras and blah 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 blah, etc., etc., etc. Okay. Then maybe after you said your piece about your introduction about Mark, maybe that after that is a perfect time to put a call to action. You're really going to have to determine where the best place for your call to action is going to be. Typically, it's going to come after your intro, okay? Or maybe sometimes a call to action can come in the middle of a podcast. You would have to remember in the interview yourself, if you're going to do an interview podcast, you're going to have to remember to place those calls to action within the actual interview, or maybe somewhere figure out a way to place a call to action. My podcast does this. In fact, I've started to actually implement some of this into my own podcast, The Swing Shift Side Hustle. The latest episodes have been doing this, where I'm asking people to contribute and support the podcast with a link that is in the description. So if you want to check out that podcast, I'll go ahead and leave the link in the description of this YouTube video so you can go check it out and see where I have segmented out my particular podcast. Now, I know I've gotten a little off track, but let's talk about how many times should you mention a particular call to action, okay? I think once per show is actually enough, all right? People will hear it the first time, and maybe you can make mention of it a second time later on down the line, but maybe once is only good enough. But one mention per podcast is probably good enough. This is very similar to what we do in radio. I might have to mention 2 different events once, which is two times in that hour. So if you have multiple things that you want to push, maybe you want to push an email newsletter list, or maybe you want to push people to a specific blog post, you might want to separate those 2 different calls to action out, but always refer them back to the show notes so they can go back into Apple Podcasts and use the user interface in order to click on the links. If I had to give you any advice about a call to action within your podcast, it would be this. It's make sure that you have your assets in place before you start creating calls to action inside of your podcast. In other words, make sure that your email newsletter is all set up so that people can start receiving emails and automated emails from you. Or maybe you need to have certain blog posts ready to go so that you can promote them. Don't say that a blog post is going to be coming up and put the link down in the description. That just doesn't make any sense, right? But I have seen that done before in the past. Just make sure that you have your assets in place so that you can push people to go to certain areas on the web, or in particular on your website, because that's where you really want to get them. Is you want to get them on your website so you can get them to take an action on your particular website. So let me ask you this. Have you done any calls to action on your podcast, and has it helped you grow your podcast? And if it hasn't, tell me what you're struggling with when it comes down to the calls to actions that you're putting inside of your podcast. I'd be really interested in trying to figure out what we can do to help you grow your podcast and grow a larger audience so that more people can listen to it. If you like this video, go ahead and leave it a thumbs up. And of course, down below, hit the subscribe button. And right next to the subscribe button, there's a little bell button. And people have been mentioning that they've been hitting the bell so they can get notified when I drop a brand new video. Last week, I didn't drop a video because I got sick. I had food poisoning, and then my refrigerator went out. What's that all about? So it's been kind of dealing with that all last week. So either way, you will get a notification when I drop a brand new video when the refrigerator is actually running and I don't have to deal with that. And of course, if you're a podcaster trying to jump into this game for the very first time and you need some help on which equipment that you want to get for your podcast, I have an essential equipment guide that you can go ahead and grab and download for completely free. I'm going to leave that up here in the card above or down in the description below, and you can go ahead and click on that and download it for free today. In the meantime, thank you guys so much for watching today's video and being patient with me. I appreciate you guys so much for all the support. I'm going to keep doing my best to keep bringing you more information on podcasting a lot better. In the meantime, we'll see you next time. Take care.